minutes. Welcome to Radio Free South Africa. This is your host, Karen Smith. Tonight we are going to start, which I hope to keep on as a monthly series, on the well-known people in South African history. Now, they're well known to South Africans, but obviously not to the rest of the world. And we drop these names into shows all the time, so casually, expecting that the rest of the world will know who we're talking about. I suddenly realized that actually they don't. So I asked my good friend, Cuan Elgin, the author of that magnificent South African history, Bulala, which you must read. He's put the whole story of South Africa into a novel form, but it is factual. It is a wonderful book that I always use for my research. So do go to Amazon, have a look for Bulala by Cuan Elgin, and educate yourself on the story of South Africa. It is full of heroes, of fights, of noble savages, of historical figures. It is a wonderful, wonderful read. So do yourself a favor and get yourself a copy. Cuan Elgin, for me, is one of the best historians of South African history because he puts it in a form that people like to read. He puts it in context. He makes the people real. He makes the situations real. He paints the most beautiful verbal pictures of South Africa, our stunning, stunning, beautiful country. And I think that may be because he was a safari person for many, many years and toured the country from tip to tip. I'm sure he's been from Cape Town to the Mozambique border, to the Zimbabwe border, and everywhere in between. So he knows firsthand how beautiful our country is, what it has to offer, how it was 20 years ago, and how it is today. He puts everything into context. He paints beautiful pictures. So I'm very proud to have him as our historian of the historical figures of South Africa. Welcome, Cuan.
Thank you, Karen, and it's nice to speak to you again, and thank you for that glowing introduction and that very nice punt for our country. Thank you.
Well, it is. Cuan, no matter what ails the country, it is still the most beautiful country in the world. It may not have the infrastructure it once had, but Mother Nature doesn't care about that.
You're quite right. We are blessed with excellent weather. We've got very varied scenery, from deserts to forests to mountains. In a way, a microcosm almost of the United States, with a bonus of elephants and lions thrown in. And of course, our South African today comprises 11 different tribes, if you call the white African a tribe as well, and they've been called that more than once. Then we are a diverse people with a diverse landscape, a diverse culture. And I think with our current rand currency being rather weak, unfortunately, it makes it a very affordable place for foreigners to travel. Surprisingly, South Africa was actually voted the cheapest country to retire to recently. India was a close second. And although we constantly complain about rising prices, and for good reason, it is still an affordable place to live and enjoy yourself. The infrastructure, as you point out, is perhaps not as good as it was at one stage, but it's still pretty good. And the roads are exceptionally good. I've heard Australians, for instance, who come out here in some numbers, say that our road network is actually far better than Australia's, and we're proud of that. It means that travel is comfortable. We have good highways, we've got good byways, and the towns themselves, most of them, are very welcoming in terms of bed and breakfast hotels of a very high standard. Some of the lodges, safari lodges, we classify as the best in the world. We don't. Let's say the World Tourism does. Cape Town is constantly voted as the best city in the world to visit, and that would be a must on any visitor's agenda. And then what we call the Garden Route, which is up from the Cape, up the East Coast, It's about a 2 or 3 day drive, circular drive, where you can see the coastal regions, the mountainous areas, and the deserts all in a couple of days. And then the west coast, very different, on the cold Atlantic side, more desert, but magnificent in its own way. And then, of course, the world-famous Kruger Park, which is in the northern regions of the country, which is subtropical. And the interior is on a plateau of an average of about 5,000 feet. Johannesburg, in fact, our biggest city, is at 1,750 meters, which was close to 6,000 feet. Most people are quite surprised. There aren't that many large cities in the world at that altitude, which gives it a magnificent climate. It lacks the humidity of the lower regions, and the seasons are very apparent there. It's quite a city, Johannesburg, and I know it perhaps has not a great reputation as a crime spot, but in the same way, I suppose, as we would think of Chicago, we think of Al Capone, and it was almost 100 years ago. So it's perceptions, but it is a bustling and dynamic city, and the gold, of course, which it's famous for, although it's starting to run out now. Is what supplied the money engine, you could say, for the rest of the country in many ways, and made South Africa an industrialized country to a greater extent than any other African country. Unfortunately, and I was just reading statistics this morning, our manufacturing sector has shrunk by 50% in the 20 years since the ANC got in. They've been in 21 years now. 50% it has shrunk. So largely due to unreasonable labor demands, shorter working hours, a higher minimum wage with low productivity, all the socialist, Marxist type rhetoric which the government spews out, and it's made a lot of investors think twice about coming into the country. As an economist once put it, foreign investment is like a cloud of dollars circling the globe looking for a safe place to land. Unfortunately, if our labor here thinks that people will only invest in this country to uplift them, then they are living in cloud cuckoo land. Investors want returns, and there would be hopefully a socio-economic upliftment component to their investment, but that would not be the driving factor. And these are the realities which unfortunately don't seem to get through to our major populace. And consequently, our manufacturing sector has seen disinvestment rather than investment. The mines are struggling now. Commodity prices are down. Demand from China, which was our largest trading partner, has dropped considerably. And our agricultural sector is under pressure. Our farmers are constantly vilified, as the Marxists do. They're the first people they pick on are the landowners, and those, of course, are the farmers who own the largest amount of land for good reason, and they are constantly demonized, vilified. They're under severe attack, physical attack. We've lost something like 4,000 of our precious farmers brutally murdered in the last 20 years, which is something like 10% of our farmers. And extrapolated to the American situation, United States, where I believe we have something like 2 million farmers, that would be 200,000 of your farmers murdered in 20 years. It's an unbelievable comparison, but it is a real one, because statistically that's how it would look. I think America would be absolutely stunned and amazed and be crying genocide if they lost 200,000 farmers to brutal murders in 20 years. Yet that is statistically the equivalent of what we've had to swallow, and no one says a word. We do, but no one seems to hear. So all these factors discriminate against mostly the white folk, who are 8.5% of the population now. At one stage we were 20%, but our population has shrunk as close on 1 million South Africans have left for greener pastures, as others have been killed off, and as the birth rate has dropped. On the other side, the birth rate's increased, and people have flooded into the country. It's very easy for someone from the north of us in Africa to come into the country. They can just about walk in, and our borders are basically porous. They don't have to have any capital to invest. They don't have to have any skills. They don't even have to have a visa half the time. And they just come into the country and very soon form squatter camps around the towns, and then demand infrastructure, demand housing, demand electricity, all of which has to be paid for by the ever-shrinking pool of taxpayers. So all those factors count against us as a minority here, yet we are still, after 360 years, we're still here. And we intend to be here for the foreseeable future, because we belong here, we're born here, bred here, and many South Africans are 10th, 12th generation. We know no other homeland, and we're Africans. It's only our skin color that makes us anything other than what is perceived to be African, but we are very much Africans, and we're very proud of our country that we built in spite of everything, and we would like to try and get on board those thinkers and thought leaders and influential people abroad, especially in the media, who perhaps in the past had a negative perception of white South Africans. We'd like to try and rectify that perception in their minds by showing our real history, which is rather different to the one which has been presented over the years. And, we are our own worst enemies in many ways. We did many things wrong. We made many mistakes in the past, and those mistakes still haunt us. But we've moved on, and we've had a full democracy for a couple of decades now. But unfortunately, the current regime has seen fit to go back on their commitment to making it a non-racist democracy,
Yes.
and they've enforced and instituted over 100 anti-white labor laws, which have basically relegated the whites from the economy, from the major economy, and they just can't get jobs in corporates. They can't get jobs in government departments or quasi-government. They can't get government contracts, etc., etc. So they've been sidelined, and it's most unfortunate, because that was the most educated, skilled sector of the population. So a lot of whites are struggling now, and it's not through lack of trying. It's because of racist legislation, which amazingly the ANC has instituted and enforces against all expectations. All the commitments and promises that were made during the negotiations before the first elections in '94 were on those lines, that there would be no more racial discrimination or discrimination on the grounds of race. That was all considered a given, and it was very much part of the Constitution, but loopholes are always found, and now the popular way of explaining it away is calling it leveling the playing fields, affirmative action, black economic empowerment, which is BEE, and we've also got broad-based black economic empowerment, but all it's done is enrich a very small black elite who have been given preferential shares in mines, particularly in big corporates. They've been given directorships, and none of it really earned by honest toil. It has been through patronage, and unfortunately, it's done is enriched a very small elite. The average black person who struggled in the past is still struggling now, and in many ways is worse off. Mm. So it's a shame. The potential was there, and to some extent still is there, to make this country something absolutely exceptional and special. We were an African powerhouse in the past. Now we've slipped down the rankings. We are number 2 in Africa in terms of our economy. Nigeria has overtaken us.
Yeah.
And to our shame, the president of Nigeria recently said that South Africa is the most corrupt country in the world. This is coming from a Nigerian. And he said one could get a bachelor's degree in crime in South Africa. Well, I think he underestimated it. You can get a master's degree in crime here and corruption. Unfortunately, the example is set right at the top. Absolute blatant corruption. And whenever a special unit is set up in the police to investigate white-collar crime, the first people they nab are government people. So immediately that unit gets disbanded and called something else, and it all starts all over again. So unfortunately, the example that's being set is not good. and trickles down. So we have to admit it now. Yes, we are a corrupt country now, and it's a great shame. It was founded on Christian principles, this country, Calvinistic in many ways, and there always was, of course, an element of corruption. There always is, and in fact, the gentleman we're going to talk about this evening, Jan van Riebeeck, who is considered the father of the old South Africa. There were even accusations against him before he became governor of the Cape. Not for corruption necessarily, but he was accused of private trading by the Dutch East India Company, which is similar to the English East India Company. And of course, they had a lot to do with the founding of New York, originally called New Amsterdam. And New York, in fact, might surprise many of your listeners, was founded within a year of Cape Town. So there's a lot of correlations between our histories. But we can get into some more depth on Jan van Riebeeck himself as we go along.
Cuan, that was a marvelous summing up of South Africa today, because what I like about what you said is that, yes, the minority white people are discriminated against, but the overall picture of that country is suffering and poverty, except for that handful of elites, as you said. The enormous black population is suffering horrifically under this ANC government. And the one sort of faint light I see shining in that is that even they are beginning to see that President Zuma's government is not good for the country. Although where that will lead and who they think should take his place is a story for another day. But right now, even the black masses are saying no. Under apartheid, we had jobs. We had clean cities. We had lack of crime. Minimal crime. I mean, obviously there's crime no matter what. But we had minimal crime. We were safe, secure. We mostly had jobs. And now, where are they, those poor people, black and white alike?
You're quite right in saying that I think there has been something of an awakening amongst the proletariat, shall we say. The average black South African, I think, has seen and watched with some dismay the goings-on at high level and the corruption which is being exposed. And immediately that is exposed, a commission is set up, and of course the commission generally just fudges the whole thing and it goes away.
Yes.
Supposedly goes away. But yes, there has been an awakening of sorts. Unfortunately, we look to the north of us, Zimbabwe, which is really a basket case. They used to call it the breadbasket of sub-Saharan Africa. Now it's a basket case. They had the highest inflation in the world. They had notes printed in trillions of Zimbabwe dollars. I think everybody knows the disaster that Zimbabwe has become. But we have that example right on our borders. And unfortunately, Robert Mugabe is still seen by the ANC as something of a hero because he, to put it crudely, gave the finger to the white minority and threw them off their farms.
Yeah.
But he did that in a response to that very same thing, that there was an awakening amongst the black electorate in Zimbabwe that he was corrupt, that his whole administration was corrupt, that they were essentially a despotic and corrupt administration, and that the country was going downhill. And when he realized that he was losing support from Mugabe, he used his trump card. Or shouldn't say trump, should I? His ace. He said to the Wovets, we call them, as it sounds when they say it, war vets, which were the liberation forces that he controlled during the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe up until 1980. He said to them, take the land. So immediately he deflected the criticism of his government and the growing resistance to it by saying, take the land. And those white farmers who were still there, many had left, but there was still a lot. And the agriculture was doing reasonably well, and they had good export markets, and the currency was still reasonably strong. He used that as a foil and he diverted the attention away from the corruption and incompetence of his government, and he created a free-for-all. And all of a sudden, these so-called war vets were invading white farms, assaulting the farmers. Some were killed. Many simply had to flee with what they could carry and their clothes on their back and their families. And they ended up in South Africa, a lot of them, or they ended up in Zambia, which had already gone through all of this and now was welcoming white farmers back because the economy was also largely agricultural, and they needed this expertise. But Zimbabwe used that grab the land philosophy as a deflection of criticism from those when they saw their power base was eroding, the administration. And unfortunately, we're seeing the same thing here. When the Zuma administration realized that the people, the ordinary people, were starting to grumble and point fingers at them, suddenly they upped the rhetoric about taking the land, and that the white farmers stole the land. And nothing could be further from the truth, and we can go into that at some stage. But they suddenly started pointing fingers again, at which they did in the past, and then it quietened down, but they suddenly started it again. And the local firebrand, a chap called Julius Malema, who runs a small party, so they've got about 6% of the seats, but very vocal. They appear to be the radicals in the country, the left radicals, Marxist type, and they're always going on about the white farmers and we must take the land. And suddenly the ANC saw, well, if that's what the radicals are saying, and we start saying it, we'll get their votes. So it's very cynical, and in fact, I think although the EFF, as they called Malema's crowd, the Economic Freedom Fighters, EFF, the joke is that it stands for everything for free.
Yeah.
But of course it isn't. But they appear to be the radicals, and that makes the ANC look a bit more moderate. So I think they like having them around in a perverse sense. But the ANC is far from moderate, and something I need to point out is that the entire cabinet of the ANC is black. There's a couple of white faces in deputy posts, but they're communists. They've never been part of the mainstream in this country. They've never stood for election. They've never garnered a single vote. Yet there they are sitting in the cabinet, and that is the typical communist way, is they don't necessarily see that they need to stand for election and as an open political party. No, they use their influence behind closed doors to steer the country their way, and the odd white face that we see in the inner circle are all communists. There's not a single captain of industry, white captain of industry. There's not a single white big businessman or anybody of any real influence who could put some sense into the decisions that are being made in this country. Certainly on the economic side, they've been completely excluded. And in fact, our most wealthy what would we call him, a mogul, is a chap called Johann Rupert. He's the son of the famous Anton Rupert, who established many, many industries in this country in the past. And he has basically inherited this entire world of finance and how economics from his family. And he's a sensible guy. And he gets berated by the Zuma administration as a majority capitalist, neo-racist, imperialist, every kind of Marxist label that they can possibly put on him. Yet he's the richest man in Africa. I mean, this guy really could do a lot to help, and obviously he has a lot of expertise and business sense, and they don't use people like that. They don't bring these people into the fold. They don't make the real powerful men, the white men who have got great economic power. They don't make them feel part of the country. They constantly vilify them, and you can't blame them then for taking their investments offshore. So the country loses again. So instead of using the enormous white expertise which was available when the country changed hands from the old nationalists to the ANC, instead of bringing them into the fold and using that expertise, they've sidelined them, they've alienated them, they've vilified them. Instead of using the core of competent and skilled and well-educated white folk who were very willing to help this country grow and very willing to to let bygones be bygones, because wrongs were done on both sides, not just on the one. And that's something we need to go into in terms of our history. But instead of making us feel part of the new South Africa, we've been completely alienated, completely sidelined. And as I mentioned, well over 100 racist labour laws instituted against the minority whites, who are now down to 8.5% of the population. So really, they keep talking about redistributing the wealth, the government. They're going to redistribute the wealth. Well, I can say that categorically the wealth has already been redistributed. There is no more. The mines are largely now owned by black shareholders, and their boards are mostly black directors. You just have to drive through an industrial area and see factory after factory, which was established by white folk with their own capital, risking their own money to establish these businesses, employing many, many black folk, mostly black folk. They are being vilified as the problem. They're not the problem, they're the solution. But who could blame them for seeking greener pastures? And I think that is a wonderful opportunity which should have been grasped with both hands by this government. We still talk of them as a new government. In fact, they've been in for 21 years now, so they're certainly not new. Governments change hands much quicker than that in the West. If you even look at the UK, Labour, Conservative, whatever, they change every so often, at least once a decade, you could say. We've had now over 2 decades of exactly the same party ruling us, and they have not taken the opportunities that were available. They have not welcomed the whites into the economic fold. They've shunted them out, and it's starting to show. The cracks are starting to show. It's a great pity. We still, as I say, fortunately, the country itself is so magnificently beautiful that tourism is still doing very well. And generally speaking, it's safe enough to visit, especially if you have a guide. He's going to take you to the places where you will be safe. And even driving self-drive holidays, if one sticks to the main routes and goes to the good places, then there's no problem. And fortunately, that is pretty well booming, our tourism industry. And the weak rand, that is the double-edged sword. Of course, everything for us becomes more expensive. All imports become more expensive. But for the visitor, everything looks remarkably cheap. And the quality of the food, the quality of the wines, the quality of the hotels, the game lodges is superb. So a wonderful place to visit. And as somebody who's been in tourism, I'm semi-retired now, but who was in tourism for 30-odd years, it's gratifying to see our country, much as we love it, through the eyes of a foreigner. They are absolutely blown away, if I can use that expression. It is. We like to say the most beautiful country in the world, and I know America is a magnificent country and very much larger than South Africa. And I know people talk of California as being magnificent and very similar in many ways to the Cape Peninsula, which we'll get round to, the establishment of the Cape, which is what we're supposed to be talking about. But we do like to proudly say, if not the most beautiful, one of the most beautiful countries in the world. And we encourage and urge people to visit, because the more that come, the word gets out. And also it exposes those in our population who haven't had a worldview, who have been pretty parochial in their thinking, to realize there's a much bigger world out there, and we can't always relate everything to South Africa. We have to see it in a world context. The world, as they say, has now become a village. If something happens in one country, it affects another. And this is why we had this debacle recently where the President, Zuma, they say it was done because he wanted a compliant Minister of Finance who would okay various shady deals, and which of trillions of dollars of who knows what. I don't even want to talk about it because it might be national security. But either way, a good black Minister of Finance was booted out, so it wasn't anything to do with his competence. He was a good, steady chap called Nene. He was booted out, and another bloke put in, who was also a black chap. It's all been going on over and above our heads here. He was put in. He lasted a long weekend because the world reacted so negatively to this change that they said, "Why have you fired a competent Minister of Finance and put in an absolute nobody, a backbencher, who doesn't have the qualifications, doesn't have the experience. This is not good. And it created such an outcry and a furore that Zuma, to everyone's surprise, actually backtracked. First time he's ever done anything like that. Actually backtracked on one of his stranger decisions, and he got rid of the new bloke and put in a chap who'd served before very well, an Indian chap, and Pravin Gordhan, and he's now back in after some years of not being Minister of Finance, and steadied the ship. But in that 1 week of chaos, the rand shed an enormous part of its value, our currency. It's created huge damage to the country in the eyes of the world, the financial world, and it's, of course, it halved the value of people's investments, their pensions. It created enormous damage to the economy of the country. One man's decision to put in somebody who would, a yes man, who would follow his orders, and that all these orders from abroad for various things would be approved. And we know by now, we're cynical enough to know that no huge order is placed abroad for equipment of any sort for South Africa without there being kickbacks. That is just the way it is now. So we're almost cynical enough to suggest that these things are only ordered because there are kickbacks. And we're talking of huge money, and the corruption is all pervasive now. So it's starting to show, and we're ashamed of that. It has to change. There is talk now of the ANC recalling, as they say, the President Zuma, or redeploying him, or but we haven't seen any concrete moves yet. There's a municipal election coming up in a couple of months, and we'll see which way the wind blows. But I don't think there's going to be any dramatic changes, and the status quo will likely be maintained. But the rand took a pounding. It hasn't recovered to any great extent. It has lost 50% of its value in the last 5 years. Our manufacturing sector has shrunk by 50% in the last 20 years. Our agricultural sector is under pressure because of these threats to our farmers. What farmer would want to invest his capital in expanding his infrastructure, expanding his farm, planting orchards, which take many years to mature and produce, when he could lose his land at any time because of these threats from the government? What farmer would want to buy a farm where the previous farmer was brutally murdered and his family brutalized? As they say here, if you kill a farmer, you kill a farm. Nobody wants to farm there. So there's all these pressures at play, and none of it has done any good for our economy. And yet they are such obvious things that can be fixed overnight. All it takes is for the government to say, listen, white folk, all 8.5% of you, we appreciate the contribution you make to the economy, and we want you to come forward, and we want you to serve in government, in the economic sectors of government, in the industrial sectors of government, in the mining sectors, even as deputy directors. But no, they will not do it because of the racist attitude they have towards the whites. And we are very much to blame. We have to admit that. For a lot of that, because we have not taken seriously the task that we need to do, to undertake, to correct the misconceptions and the misperceptions of the past. We were our own worst enemies when it came to PR. We do, unfortunately, as in America and here, the same people control the media there as they do here, and they tend to be leftish. And as a result, we were slated for decades as being, really nasty folk, when in fact we're not. And we've always got along pretty well. On the average South African of whatever color, whatever race, whatever creed, have always got along pretty well. But it's the politicians here who stir up the dissent. They stir up the animosity, not the average people. Any South African will tell you your day-to-day interaction with other South Africans of every description is good. We're a friendly, open, outspoken people, and we have a good sense of humor. Generally, we are a happy people, but our government is making us unhappy, and it's a shame. We have the potential to once again be a powerhouse in every sphere. South Africa has always been at the cutting edge of technology when it comes to medicine, nature conservation. We used to have amongst the best tertiary education in the world. We've slipped way down the rankings on that. All those things can be fixed. None of them are unfixable. And it just takes political will. It takes putting aside the animosity which exists perhaps from the past politically, and which has been fired up again, and put all that aside and get on with the job of running what could be a vital potential powerhouse and run it properly. So we have these problems. But other than that, we have a very rich culture, as I say, very rich history, as America does, very many correlations which we can talk about, and very many lessons which America can learn from South Africa and the way things are working out here.
Well, Cuan, this seems like the perfect place. You said that we are good people. We get on well, generally speaking, one-on-one relationships amongst all races. We're a friendly people. We created a first world country, and we can do it, return it to what it once was. So it seems like a really good place to say, right, where did we come from? How did these people start? What happened? The deepest, darkest Africa. How did this tribe of Afrikaners, white South Africans, how did they begin? So tonight, in our series, the first person we are going to talk about in this series of historical figures of South Africa is going to be the father, the founder of South Africa, Jan van Riebeeck. We know him,
well,
we know about him, but the rest of the world does not. So, Cuan, let rip.
Thank you, Karen. Jan van Riebeeck was, well, his full name was Johan Antonizoon van Riebeeck. And he was born in Culemborg in the Netherlands, son of a ship's doctor. And he himself qualified as a physician and worked as a ship's surgeon for the Dutch East India Company, which were known as the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie. He was transferred to the Eastern Realms in Indonesia, which, like Jakarta, they called Batavia, the Batavian Republic. And he operated as an administrator, displaying distinct talent. He'd soon done rather well for himself, and too well, some thought, as I alluded to earlier, too well, some thought, for a Dutch company man. The Dutch corporates were known to be tight-fisted, and he seemed to be doing rather too well. And he was eventually accused of private trading. This is in the East Indies. And he appeared before what we'd call a disciplinary board these days, and a similar thing there. But he was essentially exonerated, but they were going to keep an eye on him. But he was a very able administrator and a very intelligent chap with an industrious, inquiring mind. He had an abiding interest in botany, and he was offered the position of a governor, in a sense, of the Cape of South Africa, which was originally called by the early Portuguese explorers the Cape of Storms, for very good reason, a very dangerous cape for shipping. But to create a better perception and encourage people to come here, it was changed to the Cape of Good Hope, which sounded a lot more positive. But to go back a little bit, the Cape itself many people think Cape Town and the Cape Peninsula is the southernmost tip of Africa. It's not, in fact. It's the most southwestern tip. A few hundred miles up the east coast is the actual southernmost tip, which is Cape Agulhas, which means Cape Needle in Portuguese, or Cape Compass. And I'll tell you the reason for that. But essentially the area was very sparsely populated by what were known as Khoi. They are not sub-Saharan Negroes as such, or Bantu, as they're sometimes referred to, the sub-Saharan Negroes. They were not black folk as such. They were a very interesting little anthropological anomaly. They're very small people. The average height would have been below 5 feet. And they have a strangely apricot-colored complexion, not black at all, and almost oriental eyes. And there's a lot of speculation and debate on where they came from. Nobody really seems to know. but there's two distinct, or there were two distinct branches of this koi. There's much argument again because, of course, they had no written history, only oral traditions, so they can't tell you themselves. But anthropologists and historians have pieced together a narrative, and it goes along the lines of two separate branches. The first to arrive many thousands of years ago, what were called Bushmen by the early settlers, the early European settlers, because they essentially lived in the bush, and they in fact call themselves today the ones that do survive as distinct as a distinct tribe or a little nation. They call themselves Busman, which means Bushmen. So they have no qualms about that. It's not politically incorrect to them. But they were called by the other branch, which were the Khoi, which means men of men, who were a slightly taller and slightly more advanced branch, who arrived some few thousand years after them. But the original ones, which were called Khoi San by the Khoi, means men who have nothing, because literally they had nothing. They didn't have possessions. They didn't consider that possessions were important. They didn't have cattle. They didn't have goats. They didn't have sheep. They had nothing. They hunted. They were essentially Stone Age men, and they used little bows and arrows with poison tips, and they were expert trackers, and those who survive as distinct Bushmen or Khoi San today, the Sun as they're called, S-A-N, they are still expert trackers, the ones who live in the wilderness, and they would hunt for a living and gather what herbs and fruits they could from the veld. Veld really means field, wild fields in Afrikaans or Dutch, veld. They would forage and hunt. And they lived a fairly peaceful life. They had little clans. There wasn't much in the way of warfare between them because they realized that every life was precious and they couldn't afford to lose people. They lived in clans of about 30. And every member of the clan was important for their survival. Things were tough. This is Africa. You've got wild animals. You've got hostile landscapes. You've got great heat and thirst and droughts, and it's an extreme environment, most of it. And so they had their own strange clicking language, clicks and whistles. It was onomatopoeic. It was based on what they heard in the wilderness, the sounds of the birds and the animals, the wind. Their language was based on those sounds, and they could communicate pretty well amongst themselves. They even contrived some fairly moving poetry in this clicking, whistling language. So that was what is supposedly politically incorrectly called Bushmen, but they have no problem with that name. Those were the San, or Khoi San. And they arrived, as I mentioned, many thousands of years ago. They painted some very beautiful rock paintings in the caves around South Africa, and they lived pretty peacefully. Then along came another wave, and these were the Khoi. As I mentioned, slightly taller and similar looking, but more advanced. They had cattle, longhorn cattle. They had fat-tailed sheep. They had dogs. Again, no written language, but they made little, almost tents out of sticks and animal hides, which portable tents, and they were pastoralists. And as they moved along and the grazing grew thin from the pressure of their stock, they would move along again. And they had picked up basic workings with soft metals like copper, so they were substantially more advanced than the first wave. And these folk moved down steadily through and assimilated to some extent with the existing the Bushmen, the San, but generally kept to themselves, and they made it as far as what is now called the Cape Peninsula, southwestern part of Africa, the southwesternmost point. And they lived in the area. They didn't build anything. They didn't establish towns. They had little, what we would call a kraal, which is almost like a corral, which would be a little fortified enclosure, fortified with thorn branches and sticks and so on to keep out lions and hyenas away from their livestock. That was about it, other than their little tents. And they lived happily enough. And then there was almost a degenerate sector of them who became known as strandlopers, which is a kind of a Dutch Afrikaans name, which means beach walkers. who were essentially beach combers and scavenged off the beach. So that although they were from those people, they were in themselves a little bit separate, and they were cave dwellers. Essentially, they would live under overhangs on the Cape Peninsula, Table Mountain, the famous flat-topped mountain. In that whole area, they would live under rock shelters, and they, again, also built nothing, had no written language, obviously, and they would mainly scavenge off the beach. And they built stone traps, piled up stones when the tide was out in the shallows of the sea, and when the tide came in and the waves went over these rocks, they would bring in fish. And as the waters receded, as the tide went out, these fish would be trapped behind these stone fish traps, and they would then spear the fish. And they lived essentially off the beach. They would harvest mussels and shellfish, and some of these stone fish traps are still there after all these many years. So they were the original inhabitants of southern Africa, not the black sub-Saharans. And for the government today, which is composed almost entirely of black sub-Saharan Negroids, to say that they own the land and that we stole the land, it's absolute rubbish. The only people who have any claim, really, to being the Aboriginals or the original or indigenous people are, in fact, the Khoi. Yet they have assimilated to a large extent with each other, the Khoi and the Khoi San. There was some interbreeding with the southernmost black tribe, which eventually made it down around about the same time as the whites were moving up, and they eventually clashed. But there's some assimilation, the Xhosa, as they're called, and Nelson Mandela himself, as you can remember, he was a fairly pale-skinned African, and that was because he had Khoi blood in him, besides Xhosa, which was his actual tribe. So a fair bit of crossbreeding there. And then some of the early European settlers, in fact, interbred with some of the local Khoi. So there became an admixture, and they ended up as what is today called Cape Coloured folk, and that's what they call themselves. And in Afrikaans, they call themselves bruin mense, which means brown people, as opposed to black people. And they don't see themselves as black. They speak Afrikaans, strangely. They don't speak black African languages. They speak Afrikaans, and when I say strangely, it's because a lot of people are surprised when they come to South Africa and the Cape particularly, and they hear the coloured folk speaking what sounds like a Germanic language, which in fact it is. It's a mixture of Dutch and Flemish and a little bit of German, a little bit of French, and it ended up as Afrikaans. It was the lingua franca in a sense. So the interaction between the early Dutch settlers and the locals was carried out in Dutch, and it eventually evolved, or some would say devolved, into what became Afrikaans. And that's what they speak. The vast majority of coloured folk in South Africa, and certainly those in the Cape, the so-called Cape Coloureds, speak Afrikaans, and they identify far more closely with the Afrikaner, the white African, than they do with the black folk. And in fact, it's thanks to them, their little voting bloc. They're about the same amount now in terms of population as the whites. So there's approximately the same number of coloured folk, so-called, and white folk in South Africa, who, if they vote together, which happens very often, and voting is very much along racial lines still to this day, if they vote together, they can keep out the ANC. And they managed to successfully do it in one province only out of the 9, because that's the only place where you find large concentrations of coloured folk and white is in the Cape. The so-called, what used to be called the Cape Province, is now called the Western Cape. It's just one of 9 provinces. But as a result of managing to keep the ANC out, although they occasionally take the odd town in the municipal elections, as a result of keeping them out, it's the best run province, it's the most well-managed province, it's the cleanest province, the roads are in the best condition, the towns are the best run. Anywhere where the ANC gets their fingers in, I'm sorry to say, they ruin it. And they know that themselves if they had the courage to actually admit it. So they are desperately always trying to take the Western Cape away from the only viable opposition at the moment, which is running this Cape. And for a brief period, the ANC did actually win Cape Town, the metropolitan area of Cape Town, in the early parts of the year 2000, 2003, I think it was. They won it because they bussed in tens of thousands of Xhosa tribespeople from the Eastern Cape, which is a separate province, bussed them in and established sprawling squatter camps all over Cape Town. and swung the vote. And briefly, a couple of years, they actually managed to take Cape Town and manage it or mismanage it, because it was a disaster. They squandered billions of dollars, we call rands, of course, which is now very weak against the dollar. It used to be twice as strong as the dollar, incidentally. It used to be $2 to a rand when I was still a young man. Now it's, I think it's about 15 rand to the dollar. Yeah. So it's worth 1/30th of what it was when I was a young adult. Either way, the ANC, as usual, squandered money and taxpayers' money and ratepayers' money, and handed out all the housing contracts and the building contracts to their pals. The work wasn't done properly. In many cases, the contractors just ran off with the money, and eventually the people of Cape Town themselves rose up against this and voted them out democratically and got rid of them. But they are absolutely desperate to try and retake at least Cape Town, if not the whole of the Western Cape. So it's a constant battle to try and keep them out. This is the one province that generates enough tax to run itself quite happily. It grows enough food to feed itself. Yet a huge chunk of the tax that is gathered here ends up in Pretoria and is squandered on the other provinces under bad circumstances. So there's often talk of the Cape, the Western Cape, seceding from South Africa. There's a lot of people who think that's a good idea. Of course, the government ANC would hate that idea, because they'd be losing their tax slaves. Yeah. They'd also be losing the most scenic part of the country, and it would end up as an African monarchy, you could say. I could see investment flooding in here if it did happen. But at the moment, the opposition here has got bigger ideas than just running the Cape, and they actually have illusions to running the entire country one day, but that's a long way off, and I don't know if we'll ever see that, but they do like to think that. But just getting back to the original inhabitants, they were then, of course, shocked to see ships arriving off their coast, and this is way back to 1488, when the Portuguese explorers, Portugal was the maritime power of the day, they started seeking a sea route to the Far East and to India, the Spice Route as it was known, looking for a passage around the Cape. And they did, in fact, eventually find one, which is simply follow the coast of Africa. When you get to the bottom, turn left and follow the coast all the way up. And strangely enough, the first explorer who actually rounded the Cape without knowing it, Bartholomew Dias, in 1488, they were blown out to sea by one of the many storms here. And when they finally gathered their wits, they realized that their compass was pointing due north, which meant that they had rounded the Cape already, and that they were off what became known as Cape Agulhas, Cape Compass, for that very reason, that the compasses were pointing due north. And the upshot of it was that they opened the sea route. They didn't go all the way to India. By then they'd been at sea for many, many months, and this crew were very ill and becoming a bit mutinous, so they actually turned back. But they had rounded the Cape. They proved it could be rounded, and they went back to Portugal. And later explorers, particularly Vasco da Gama, was the next one round, and he actually made it all the way around and all the way up to India. So the sea route was opened up. And this is the late 1400s. But notably, the Portuguese explorers saw no black people whatsoever anywhere near the Cape. They saw these Hottentot people, as they called them. Well, the Dutch called them that later, but the Portuguese saw these people, which were known as Khoi, and they were not black Africans. They were, as I've described them. And the only black Africans that later explorers saw was 1,000 kilometers or close to 1,000 miles further up the east coast into what is now known as the Eastern Cape. And they'd stopped there as the migrating tribes coming down from Central and East and West Africa, the Bantu tribes, Nguni speaking, as we say. They had migrated down, and it was a natural barrier where they stopped. No other reason than that the climate changes there from temperate to almost a Mediterranean-type climate with long, dry summers and wet winters. Mm. And the vegetation changes from good grassland and pasture for their cattle. They were cattle herders. to scrubland, what we call fynbos, which means fine bush. It's kind of a scrubby, very beautiful in its own way, proteas being the most prominent flower amongst it, but not very good for cattle grazing. So they stopped there. And also the crops that they were used to growing were not suitable for cold, wet winters, and they stopped. So that's as far as the south as the Bantu, the black sub-Saharan tribes migrated, and they stopped there. And the early explorers' records verify that. They were nowhere near the Cape. So to claim that the black tribes owned the land and the whites stole it from them is absolute rubbish. And we've proven it again and again, and yet people still want to believe it perhaps, but it's not true. And the later explorers were English. They stopped off the Cape. They dropped anchor in some of the inlets, and they explored to some extent, but they didn't settle. They moved on. It was considered pretty hostile. And then the Dutch, and our hero here, Jan van Riebeeck, he was on his way back to Holland, to the headquarters in Amsterdam, when they stopped at the Cape to rescue the survivors of shipwreck. If I can quote from Bulala, I see we're coming up for the hour, so
yes,
I'll be
we
quick.
are. We have about a minute before an ad
Okay.
break.
Well, then just briefly, Van Riebeeck had been aboard a fleet that rescued the crew of the Haarlem, which had run aground at the Cape in 1647. The 58 crew of this vessel had established a wood and sand fort to protect themselves and their valuable cargo while awaiting rescue, and had explored, hunted, and traded with the locals. And it was on the basis of their report that a decision was made to establish a halfway refreshment station in that area, and Jan van Riebeeck was reckoned to be the man for the job.
That is a perfect place for us to stop. We will be back in a few
Riebeeck
minutes.
was the right man for the job. He was born in Culemborg in the Netherlands, son of a ship's doctor. Van Riebeeck himself later qualified and worked as a ship surgeon for the Dutch East India Company. He was later transferred to the Eastern Realms in Batavia, where he operated as an administrator, displaying distinct talent. He soon had done rather well for himself, and too well, some thought, for a Dutch company man. He was accused, as I mentioned earlier, of private trading, but he essentially got a slap on the wrist. What is remarkable is that he was only in his early 20s at this stage, and he'd already been promoted a couple of times. But after his disciplinary hearing, he was sent home to Netherlands. And on the voyage, the fleet anchored in Table Bay in order to collect most of the ship's company of the wrecked ship, the Nieuwe Haarlem. And Van Riebeeck had the opportunity to spend 18 days exploring the area. And on his return to Holland, he strongly supported the report that these survivors of the shipwreck made, that this was a good place to establish a revictualling station on the southernmost or southwesternmost extremity of Africa. And on the basis of his report, the board of directors, the Hera 17, the 17 lords, decided that they would go ahead with this. And in March 49, Van Riebeeck married Maria de Quillery, who was of French Huguenot, as we say it. Americans say Huguenot, I think, but we say Huguenot. She was living in Holland, but of French Huguenot extract, and quite an independent, liberated type of woman. She never changed her surname. She kept it, Maria de la Quillery. She never became Maria van Riebeeck. And they set up home in Amsterdam, but had a child, and unfortunately the child died in just a couple of years later, and their second child was born the same year. And during that period, Van Riebeeck, as I say, he was an up-and-coming corporate man, and still in his early 20s, and he was by then, of course, later 20s. He had already been sent to the Barbados in the Caribbean, to Greenland, and various places on exploratory trips for the company, looking for trade and trade routes. And when the company directors decided to establish this outpost, they decided he was the man. And he was an intelligent, industrious man with an inquiring mind. As I say, surprisingly, he was still in his 20s when all of this happened. And he was sent out to the Cape. He had an abiding interest in botany, so he found the incredible variety of flora of the Cape most fascinating. Just Table Mountain itself has got something like 3,000 different species of flora, more than the entire British Isles. That's one mountain in the Cape.
Wow.
And although he didn't relish the difficult prospect of having to establish fresh produce gardens and orchards from scratch on what was then still a pretty inhospitable Cape Peninsula, and to trade for cattle and sheep from the Khoi herders who pastured their livestock nearby. He thought that the opportunity to investigate the floral kingdom would hold some appeal. And he went out in 3 small ships, the Dromedaris, on which he took his wife and 2 nieces and their son, and 2 other supply ships. Interestingly, it took 4 months in those days to get from Holland to the Cape. 4 months. A modern liner would do it in a week or 2, and of course you can do it overnight by air these days. But in those days it took 4 months, and they only lost 1 man on their ship from sickness, but the 2 other ships which were sailing along behind them lost a total of 130 men,
Wow.
mainly in those days from things like scurvy. And as they hugged the coast in West Africa on their way down, sometimes malaria. But loss of life was great in those days, and traveling by ship was hazardous. But in time, this talented man would become known as the father of South Africa. Nowadays, of course, he's called the father of the old South Africa, and the great Nelson Mandela, the father of the new South Africa. But either way, a handsome portrait of him was on the banknotes for many, many years of Jan van Riebeeck. Nowadays, we've got Mandela's face on the notes. Well, his first official task, Jan van Riebeeck, when he landed at Table Bay in 1652, was to build a jetty and a fort to protect the company's interests against a perceived threat from the Khoi, which never really materialized. And in fact, the fort, substantial as it turned out to be, never saw a shot fired in anger. They actually got on pretty well. There were some uprisings of the locals. There was some cattle theft and a few clashes, but essentially they got on reasonably well. And Van Riebeeck's first attempt at such a fortification was only moderately successful, to say the least. It is an earth-walled fort, which was subject to the ravages of the ocean waves and the stormy winds of the wet winters, and life within its damp, crumbling embankments was rather miserable. But Van Riebeeck wasn't easily deterred, and he then established a quarrying operation. And as the years went by and time moved on, a substantial fort, which is today called the Cape Town Castle, was built. It's a 5-pointed star-shaped fort, complete with a moat, and it grows where once only strandlopers, beachcombers, and Khoi herders had roamed. Below the rugged flat-top mountain of towering above. And these cave dwellers watched these industrious strangers in some awe and wonder.
Mm.
And though the station was established as a mercantile operation for profit, one of the first things Van Riebeeck did was to establish the Calvinistic Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa. And they brought out a pastor, a Dutch Reformed pastor, and some of the earliest members of that little congregation were in fact converted and baptized Jewish merchants. Then Van Riebeeck instituted legislation providing for the welfare of the fauna and flora in the area. That's something else, as I say. We sometimes our own worst enemies, South Africans. We haven't had good PR in years past, and often it was said, "Oh, the whites came and raped the land and killed all the game."
Yeah.
It's absolute rubbish, and I can expound on it at some stage. But Van Riebeeck, virtually as soon as he arrived, he started issuing what they called placats, which is a legal notice or proclamation protecting the fauna and flora of the area. And in 5 years after he was there, all game and all birds were protected and would not be shot. They did have certain quotas for certain problem animals that, like what they called sea cows, which were in fact hippopotamus. They called them sea cows. To this day in Afrikaans, a seerkoei, a sea cow, is a hippopotamus. They were quite a problem and a very dangerous animal, so they were allowed to shoot a few of them for meat, etc. And he kept issuing these proclamations, these placats, these legal notices, which controlled the harvesting of ivory, horns, and feathers, and anything that was harvested had to be sold directly to the company, so they kept a good control of it. And unfortunately, of course, being a corporate and having taken the initiative to establish this refreshment station, they controlled the prices, which didn't go down well with the people who worked for them, because very often they felt they were being paid very low prices for their produce, and the more and more they wanted to farm on their own and supply to whoever they wanted, including other nations passing ships, which of course didn't make the Dutch happy. But either way, the game and flora were largely protected, And but as I mentioned, there was one or two uprisings by local Khoi, and on a rainy day in 1659, so that was 7 years after Van Riebeeck arrived, the day was chosen because the wet weather would make the matchlock muskets of the Dutch rather less reliable than usual. A major Khoi clan led by its chief called Daman, or a sub-chief, perhaps he was, they're not too sure. He launched a series of raids on the new outlying farms. And he'd, in fact, this chap, Daman, this Khoi, had been nurtured by the Dutch and even sent for a while across the sea to Batavia to be schooled in the Dutch language and to learn something of their culture and act as an interpreter. But he managed to hold the monopoly of the trade between his people, the Khoi, and the Dutch, and prevented any other clans than his own from even getting close. But as the reality of the Dutch enclave and its continuing expansion finally dawned on him, Daman decided to try and drive the whites back into the sea. Now, that's been a recurring theme throughout our history. And he used to taunt a girl called Eva, who was originally called Kratoa. She was the loyal servant of Van Riebeeck's wife, Maria, who is referred to in history as Maria van Riebeeck, but as I say, she actually kept her surname Maria de Quillery. She was their loyal servant and interpreter, and he would taunt her, this man, and say, "Here comes Kratoa, the advocate of the Dutch, and she will tell her own people stories and lies, and in the end betray them all." But Eva was taught the Christian religion. She became fluent in Dutch and acted as an interpreter for the locals. Anyway, these raids on the outlying farms briefly forced the settlers to move back closer to the protection of the fort, but Dutch military retribution soon restored the peace, and a truce was established between the Khois and the Europeans. And when I say European, it's because it wasn't just Dutch. At that stage, there were a lot of what almost could be called corporate managers, civil servants, etc., who were coming out to the Cape. Very many of them German. They tended to be on the military side and on the security side. We had Scandinavians. We had Flemish. And in fact, Afrikaans, which eventually evolved from the way the locals spoke Dutch there, has very many similarities to Flemish or Vlaams, as it's called there. And in fact, as a South African who can speak both English and Afrikaans, I find it much easier to understand Flemish these days than Dutch, because Dutch has evolved and has many modern words in it. Afrikaans has kind of stayed where it was. And it's to a modern Dutch-speaking person, hearing someone speak Afrikaans, it sounds to them like somebody reading out of a 400-year-old Dutch book, because it's almost an archaic language to their ears, but it's our language in everyday use here. And Van Riebeeck did an interesting thing. When the Khoi were stealing cattle, he established a fast-growing almond hedge, very spiky hedge, and he planted it around the settlement to stop the movement of stolen cattle. It was only moderately successful, but remains of this spiky hedge survive to this day in the world-famous Kirstenbosch Gardens. They're still there. Anyway, eventually this chap, this Khoi, who acted as interpreter but eventually turned on the Dutch, he eventually died in 1663, and the company diarist recorded, "For his death, none of us will have cause to grieve, as he has been in many respects a mischievous man towards the company with capital C." That would be the corporate of the day, the Dutch East India Company. Well, as time went on and the various Khoi clans seemed content to raid each other's cattle herds and leave the Dutch herds alone, they were still building up their herds, the Dutch bringing in new blood and trading with the locals. There were these indecisive battles and a few clashes, but the Dutch then imported horses, which gave them the mobility to thoroughly rout the more aggressive Khoi clans. So things settled down again, and the origins of what is now called a Basotho pony in South Africa, which is a small version of what we call a boerperd, which is a farmer's horse, a regular workhorse, is an descendant of the horses that the Dutch brought in. And the smaller, more nimble ones were taken eventually up into the mountains by, much later, some of the black tribes, especially the Basotho, as they're called, into the mountain kingdom of Lesotho, which is landlocked in the middle of South Africa, and they're now known as Basotho ponies. But that's where they originally came from. Anyway, the relations, as I say, settled down between the various clans and the Dutch, and there was a fair bit of trade. The Khoi had some access to copper and from the mountains, and they traded this for cloth and hardware, etc. But Van Riebeeck was never particularly happy in the Cape. He missed the hustle and bustle of the metropolises of Holland, and he was essentially a city man, although he, as I mentioned, was interested in botany. But he saw the slowly growing settlement around him, which was at that stage called Kaapstad, the Dutch name for Cape Town. It only later started being called Cape Town, but Kaapstad. And he considered it pretty much a godforsaken place. His wife wasn't particularly keen on it either, because she considered the locals pretty lazy. They didn't want to work even for fairly good pay. So they started to import slaves from their domains in the east, some from Madagascar, from Malaysia. And the first slaves were imported to the Cape. Quite a few of them were actually political prisoners who'd risen up against the Dutch authorities in the east. And some were Muslims, so they introduced a new element to the Cape, Muslim religion, although today it's only perhaps 2% of the population of South Africa is Muslim. The vast majority are Christian. But this was a new element brought in, and they tended to be quite skilled, the Malays. And they were the tailors and the carpenters and the coopers and the cobblers, and they tended to run those sort of trades. And they did reasonably well for themselves. Which will surprise many people, a slave could be released after a certain period of service, or when a male turned 25 or a female 22. The owner could release them quite happily, and they'd become what were known as free burghers, free citizens. So they were not trapped in slavery. And of course, in those days, this is 360 years ago, slavery was common all over the world. It wasn't exceptional here. But there was a very strict law enacted right from the beginning by the Dutch authorities that the company may not enslave any locals. So no South African has ever been enslaved, and that will surprise people too, because I used to get, when my days of tourism, I sometimes get American visitors. We'd be driving through a beautiful mountain pass on a superbly built road, and I'd get a voice behind me saying, "Oh, was this pass built by the slaves?" And I'd say, "Well, no, why would you think that?" And they'd say, "Well, we heard South Africa was built by the slaves." And I'd take the opportunity to say, well, as a matter of fact, slavery was abolished in South Africa in the early 1830s, which was 30 years before it was abolished in the United States. And in fact, segregation as such only went on into the 80s, late 80s in South Africa, 25 years after the United States. So our histories have many parallels. And no, South Africa was not built by the slaves. This particular mountain pass, let's say we're on, was built by Thomas Bain, who was a Scottish road engineer. So, there is that perception that the country was built, by the slaves under the lash. It's not true. And we abolished, as I mentioned, slavery a good 30 years before the United States did. Either way, after 10 years of toil, Van Riebeeck and his modest band of company employees had achieved moderate success. They had established vegetable gardens and orchards and irrigated by streams which tumbled down off the mountain. A town had been laid out, Cape Town, still small, with maybe 300 European inhabitants, had sprung up, and it consisted mainly, as I mentioned, of artisans, farmers, soldiers, and sailors, either employed by the company or dependent upon it. But they still struggled to meet the growing demand for fresh produce required by the many passing ships. And his wife, Jan van Riebeeck's wife, Maria, commented that the indigenous inhabitants of the Cape, that's the Khoi, were not willing to bend their backs in paid labour. And yet the Hera 17, the board of directors, the 17 lords in their plush boardrooms in Amsterdam and Batavia, were still not satisfied with progress. So we must submit a request for more Eastern slaves to be imported, because they're at least capable of being trained as artisans, and some of them became quite skilled. As I mentioned, the company had forbidden the Dutch to enslave any of the locals, and then a few black slaves started arriving from Portuguese traders off the African east and west coast, and they were considered robust, but also not that skilled. As time went on, Batavians, Indians, Malays began to be imported. Not all slaves; some were regular folk, and the recruitment of officials, soldiers, tradesmen, etc., went on from Europe, bringing in Swiss people, German, Scandinavian, French, Flemish, And so the population of Cape Town grew under the governorship of Jan van Riebeeck. He was considered a very fair man. He was firm but fair, and he gained the respect of those under him. Any doubts about his abilities were soon shed. He was a competent chap. And the Dutch, interestingly, had no interest in colonizing the Cape at all. They wanted to keep it as their private plantation, in a sense, to supply their ships. And anyone who worked for them had to work for them alone. And anyone who built for the company. Anyone who grew anything supplied the company's stores and ships at prices set by the company. And as a means of escaping from this rather overpowering and all-pervasive economic control of tight-fisted Dutch corporate governance, many white citizens volunteered to work as laborers on the expanding farms. So these so-called sort of indentured servants of the company, after they'd worked a sometimes undefined period of time, arbitrarily determined by Van Riebeeck, were granted the privilege of becoming free burghers, so-called free citizens. And they were the first free white Africans. And they, of course, would have children, and those were the first white African citizens born. And this is in the 1660s, so 360 years ago, close to. And around that time in history, Peter Stuyvesant, a Dutchman, served as the last colonial Dutch governor of New Amsterdam in New Netherlands in the United States. And that, of course, became New York, and the area further north became New England. And then the British drove the Dutch out of the Americas. And by 1660, so this is 8 years after Van Riebeeck arrived, there were only about 120 free white citizens. And 85 years later, this is 1745 or so, there were only about 1,000 white Africans had been born. But they did see themselves as Africans. In fact, when I was writing Bulala, the book that we mentioned earlier, the history of South Africa, my American editor, Robert Balacius, or Balakaias, as I think the Americans say it, we say Balacius. Balakaias is a prolific author himself, and I would, in fact, call him a genius. I think he's written about 50 books. Wow. And he and I had many electronic tussles over the Atlantic by email because he's never visited South Africa. And there's a lot of colloquialisms which were difficult for him to understand, being American. For instance, to call an Afrikaner, a man of Africa, a white African, to call him a Dutchman is actually an insult. And Robert would say, but I know a lot of Dutch people and they're lovely people. I said, yes, indeed they are. So it's not that there's anything wrong with them. It's just that as early as this, back in Van Riebeeck's day and in the decades following, those who were born in Africa started calling themselves Afrikaners or Afrikanders, yes, which essentially meant man of Africa. And in fact, in German or Dutch, if you speak of an African, you talk of an Afrikaner. But in this context, they were actually white. Although there were some brainmense, brown people who were colored folk who of the admixture that was there, also started to call themselves Afrikaners. And to call someone a Dutchman in those days, the Dutch were still pretty sophisticated, wealthy people from Amsterdam. They wore the lace collars and the big wigs and the silver-buckled shoes and fancy dresses. So to call one of these rugged Afrikaners a Dutchman was to call him a dandy, that he dressed like a city guy, So it was kind of an insult, but it became a joke, and it's not an offensive thing here at all. But an Afrikaner is an Afrikaner, and a Dutchman is a Hollander. Very different. That was the difference. So this was a very slowly growing white population because the Dutch had no interest in colonizing the area. You worked for the company, that was it, and that's all that was available in terms of employment until the first few farmers started to break away and started buying land from the company, the land which the company had bought from the locals with good exchange. So they didn't steal anything, they bought it. And in fact, the people who sold it to them, in a sense, were really chancing their arm too, because they didn't own it either. They were wandering herdsmen in the area. So this is going back 360 years. I very much doubt that the modern Americans would entertain land claims from the original inhabitants of the area around New York to say that, they were the original first Americans, Native Americans, that they want their land back. the farmers here, as we call it Boers now, and I'll explain the difference between an Afrikaner and a Boer, if there is really a difference. They have been farming the land here as long as the American farmers have been farming the land in the United States. So I think it would come as a major shock to the American farmers to have somebody put on a land claim on his farm, because centuries ago his great-great-grandfather came through there with his cattle. It's a ridiculous situation, but that's what we've got here in this country now. Our farmers are under siege. Their land is being claimed on spurious claims, backed by the government, because that's what they want. They want to take away the land from the landowners so that they control the land and the food. Control the land and the food, you control the people. It's the Marxist way. Excuse me. And in fact, the South African farmers, as I say, have been farming as long as the American farmers, and they have bought and sold land over centuries with title deeds, and have every right to keep their land. Either way, the slow-growing population of whites became a problem eventually, because the whites never became more than 20% of the population of South Africa, even at their peak, which was around 4.5 million at that stage. It's now dropped to around 4 million, some say less, and they are now 8.5% of the population, so less than half of what they were 50 years ago in terms of percentages. By comparison, a few million Europeans, this is by the early 1800s now, a few million Europeans had been encouraged to settle in the Americas, and a few 100,000 had made their way to Australia and New Zealand. At that stage, there were probably only 1,000 white Africans, maybe two, at that stage. So it was a very slow-growing population, this future white tribe of southern Africa. And some of the very first Dutch settlers, it has to be said, amongst whom there was a shortage of eligible European women, took Khoi or slave wives in those days, but this practice was soon outlawed. So apartheid isn't a new thing, and it's an extremely old thing. As early as 1685, the Dutch passed laws banning the relationships between Europeans or whites and the locals or blacks. And it was at some stage actually so strictly applied that if a man was found consorting with a non-white slave, he'd be flogged. The woman, they didn't harm the woman if in those cases, but they would be shunned, and it was against the law. And this is why apartheid itself in South Africa, which we are infamous for, lasted 40 years actually. Officially, the Dutch introduced it in a sense, but later the British came, they reinforced those laws, and so it went on. But the Afrikaner, the white modern-day African, has been blamed for this, when in actual fact the Dutch and the British instituted it. But apartheid, officially under the name apartheid, was actually only 40 years, which is about 1948 to 1988. That was official, and that's what we have the albatross around our neck to this day. Either way, many of the locals in the Cape converted to Christianity, and it became almost an unwritten code that you stuck to your own race group, and that was that. And many could justify it biblically. I think if one just has to read Ezra, the book of Ezra 9 and 10, it's pretty clear that that was the rule. And the difference between the Afrikaner and the Boer, if I could just briefly explain, they are the same people essentially, but the Afrikaner are those who evolved in a sense in the Cape. They grew into the Afrikaner people in the Cape. And then in the early 1820s, when the British had taken over the Cape, a lot of the Afrikaners who'd become pastoral farmers, trekboers as they were called, boer simply means farmer in Dutch, who were moving slowly inland with their cattle, they didn't want to be ruled by the British. They found them oppressive. The Dutch type language became second on the rung after English, and they just saw this as new oppressors. They thought they'd broken away from the Dutch governors. Now we had the English, and they started moving inland. So these trekboers eventually, in later years, in the mid-1800s, established two Boer republics in the hinterland, the Orange Free State, as it was called, named after the Dutch Prince of Orange, and the Transvaal or Zuid-Afrikaanse Republic, the first South African republic, which was known as the Transvaal, or Trans the Vaal River, and then Trans the Orange River, Orange Free State, and the Transvaal, the two Boer republics, and they called themselves Boers. And you got, of course, the Anglo-Boer War. There were two of them. First one was more a series of battles. The second one was a full-scale war, which lasted 2.5 years, and that was known as the Anglo-Boer War, where Britain attacked the two Transvaal the Transvaal and the Free State republics to essentially steal the gold and the diamonds.
Yeah.
That was the bottom line. But they weren't known as the Anglo-Afrikaner War because the Afrikaners were essentially, as I say, in the Cape, and the Boers were in the north in the republics. And some of the Afrikaners in the Cape were loyal to Britain. They saw themselves as British subjects. And as a result, the Anglo-Boer War was almost a civil war in a way, because there were many Afrikaners in the Cape who didn't approve of their more independent cousins up country. They're almost jealous of them because of their freedoms, really, and were loyal to Britain. So it almost ended up in a civil war. But either way, that's jumping forward a bit. Back to Van Riebeeck, young Van Riebeeck. He kept applying for a transfer. He wasn't entirely happy where he was in the Cape. He wanted to get back in the mainstream of corporate life, and he applied for a number of transfers. He was turned down every time and told, carry on. And eventually, after 10 years, they said to him, okay, we think you've done a pretty good job, and you've done what we asked you to do, which was establish this trading station and refreshment station in the Cape. And he managed to get a transfer, and off he went. And so he moved out of Cape life, and there were a series of governors after him, some very competent, some not so competent. But Jan van Riebeeck, is seen as the father of the old South Africa. And the Dutch, of course, are fine to this day agricultural engineers. They're famous for their dikes, of course, reclaiming land, etc. And they established a network of canals throughout the Cape, far inland. And even the little Karoo towns, as we call them, Karoo being there's the little Karoo and the great Karoo. One is semi-desert and one is less arid. The Klein Karoo is the more fertile one, the great Karoo. But there's canals in all the little towns, which still work perfectly to this day, which were established by the Dutch. So we have much to thank them for. And they established the Western Cape as a real bread and fruit cornucopia. It is very beautiful, and the vineyards in the Cape are justly famous throughout the world. The French Huguenots, which came out, only about 200 families or heads of families with their wives and children in 1688. So that's 30 odd years after Van Riebeeck arrived. They came out from Holland. They'd fled to Holland after the Edict of Nantes was revoked, and they were then oppressed as Protestants. And the Dutch, as even today, pretty cosmopolitan. They took them in as refugees, in a sense, but they were highly skilled and very well educated people. And being French, many of them had worked or owned vineyards in France, and they were pretty good at this. So the Dutch had a go at growing vines to supply wine to the ships and to export to Holland. And when the very first bottle was produced by the Dutch, Jan van Riebeeck, they gave him the first bottle, and he said, "Praise be to the Lord." But his wife, Maria, took a sip and said, "It's horrible." So they decided they didn't really know how to grow grapes and make wine. So the pragmatic company authorities soon found a way to solve this problem, which was to bring in these French Huguenots. So they encouraged French Huguenot immigrants to the Cape to bring them winemaking skills. And a number of them were glad to undertake the adventure, considering the prospect of living in a climate similar to some regions of France. It's almost a Mediterranean climate. And due to the fact that the Cape was a Calvinist stronghold. So they were Protestants, very much so. They'd fled to Holland, as I mentioned, to escape the religious persecution in the hands of their own Catholic king, King Louis XIV, when he revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Which King Henry IV had granted to the Protestants to ensure their freedom of religion. Well, these Huguenots were granted so-called free passage on company ships and so-called given basic farming implements, seed, and some cattle upon landing at the Cape. But in keeping with the Dutch corporate character of those times, these grants were actually in the form of loans, which had to be repaid. So it was not easy for them, but these deeply religious Huguenots were educated, hard-working people, and they were keen to plant the French vine cuttings, which they'd nurtured on the long sea voyage south. And they were sent off. This is just shortly after Van Riebeeck finally got his transfer. They were sent off to the interior of the Cape to an area which became known as Franschhoek, which means French Corner. And they established the well-known Franschhoek Paarl and Stellenbosch wine and brandy regions, and they justly now world famous. So Van Riebeeck, he established the basis of what became a very successful agricultural enterprise, and as I say, all the infrastructure that went with it, the town of Cape Town itself, and it was a bustling port. It was known as the Tavern of the Seas for some time. It was quite a good place to stop over to replenish, and a lot of taverns, of course, for the sailors. So it became known as the Tavern of the Seas. And the French influence for a while livened things up a bit. The Dutch were considered fairly duur, but the more French followed in the wake of the Huguenots, and things livened up and got a bit more colourful. And the French, to this day, there's still families in the Franschhoek area who still speak French, but of course they also speak Afrikaans, and and Dutch was the language of the Cape, so they had to pick that up, and then later on English. And a lot of our surnames, which we consider Afrikaans surnames, regular South African names like Dutoy or Dutois, Leroux, etc., Duplessis, they're all French names. We think they're Afrikaans names because they are such common names now amongst our Afrikaner folk that we consider them South African names, but they're in fact from the French Huguenot. So we have a smattering of German surnames, French surnames, Dutch surnames, Scandinavian surnames, English, of course, who arrived considerably later. They took over the Cape from the Dutch in about 1800. Initially, it was supposed to be a limited takeover, and they were going to leave as soon as things settled down and the wars with France and so on. They wanted to stop France getting hold of the Cape. But eventually they just took over, and there was in fact a battle fought between the Dutch and the English in the Cape when the Dutch realized that the English were actually invading. But they did take over, and for the next 100 or so years, the Cape was British, very much so, and Dutch became the second language after English. So it was very much a changed place from the one Van Riebeeck saw. It had become quite civilized. There was theatre, there was fashion. They lacked nothing that the Europeans had. The ships, of course, were constantly coming and going. So although their news was sometimes perhaps a month or two behind the times, the fashion certainly tried to keep up with Europe, and it became a very civilized place. And to the extent where some of the farmers who were now free burghers, free citizens, who were farming, were doing very well, and they delighted in riding in their glistening carriages into town, pulled by beautiful horses. And then one silly young farmer decided to try and be the centre of attraction, and he managed to tame a team of zebras who to pull his coach into tears. But unfortunately, the old zebra is a sprinter, not an endurance animal. So they were pretty tired by the time they got to Cape Town. And he very embarrassingly had to replace them with scruffy old mules to pull his carriage back home again. But these were the times, and the coloured folk, as I mentioned, were the tradesmen, the artisans, etc. The Dutch or the Europeans tended to be the administrators and the farmers, and so it went on. And a very lively and colourful culture grew in the Cape, which to this day is unique in the South African context. The Dutch who trekked from the Cape became the Boers. Established their republics in the hinterland, which had been cleared for them, incidentally, by the genocidal raids of the man who founded the Zulu nation, Shaka Zulu. And it'll surprise a lot of people that the Afrikaners, as a recognizable tribe, if you want to call them that, ethnic group, are far older than the Zulus as a recognizable nation. The Zulus were unheard of until the early 1800s. They were a minor clan. Ruled by a chief, and up rose this young warrior, Shaka, and he was actually the bastard son of one of the chiefs, and he eventually rose to take over the chieftainship. He was a great warrior, and he established an army, and slowly but surely they either completely wiped out the tribes around them or assimilated them and established the Zulu nation. So the Zulu nation was unheard of before about 1820, whereas the Afrikaners had been called the Afrikaners since the 1700s. So they're considerably older than the Zulus. So they have as much claim as anyone else to being South Africans as much claim as any Zulu, if not more. As I say, the black tribes were moving down into South Africa from Central, East and West Africa at the same time that the trekkers, the white farmers, the Boers, were trekking inland. And of course, they eventually clashed, but not with Shaka. Shaka barely saw a white man. One or two traders made contact. He had no problem with them. It was his descendants, or in fact, those who murdered him and took over his kingdom, Dingaan and later Chetswaya, they clashed with the whites. But Shaka didn't. And in fact, he found them rather interesting because their medical expertise saved his life once after a failed assassination attempt, etc. But to briefly go back to Jan van Riebeeck, he was our first governor, you could say, father of the old South Africa, and he, at the moment, is kind of forgotten because the current regime, as I like to call them, the ANC, their hero and role model, of course, was Nelson Mandela, and our money now reflects his face rather than Van Riebeeck's. So we've got what we now call the new South Africa, which is very different from the old South Africa. But Van Riebeeck, we still see, as white South Africans, certainly, as the father of our country.
But he's been exorcised from South Africa
Very
by a
much
witch
so.
doctor.
And in fact, Zuma, the current president of the ANC and the country, not too long ago, he said something about, and when Jan van Riebeeck arrived, that's when all the trouble started.
Yes.
Well, in actual fact, that's when all the development started. And thank God for him, because we have today a pretty good infrastructure, which was established originally by the Dutch. We had a good education system, our parliamentary system, our administration system, our medical facilities, etc., all started there. Our law, we had Roman Dutch law. We still have it to a large extent today. That all came from them. All the structure, there was no written language here amongst any of the tribes. They hadn't invented the wheel yet. So it was a wilderness. And we need to actually appreciate what they did bring with them.
Yes.
More good than bad. And I actually had the opportunity to address a gathering at the old Parliament buildings in Cape Town a couple of years ago. And it was a gathering of, surprisingly, the Khoi, or those who now are representing the remnants of the Khoi, the original Aborigines, who are saying, why have we been forgotten? This black government wants to take all the land from everybody. What about us? We were the indigenous people. We were the first people here, not the blacks. And this gathering was of them. It was sort of a minority ethnic groups like the Khoi and various others, and the Afrikaner, because they now have no homeland at all either. In fact, they're relegated, the white African is relegated to a third-class citizen in this country, discriminated against on every side legally. You can legally discriminate against whites. In fact, it's encouraged. All the labour laws stacked against them, etc. But either way, I had an opportunity to address this gathering, and I had listened with some interest to the Khoi staking their claim, really, and a few others. And one or two of them said, we're talking about the legacy of colonialism and all the bad stuff. And I listened with interest, and eventually I had my chance to talk. And I said, it's been a very interesting afternoon, and I've heard a lot of good stuff and bad stuff about the settlers who first came here and established Cape Town and the country. And we have to be realistic, and let's get real. If it wasn't for the so-called legacy of colonialism, we wouldn't be having this meeting in this magnificent parliamentary building, sitting on these beautiful green leather benches. We'd be sitting on the side of a hill on boulders, because that's all there was when they got here.
Yes.
So let's get real. Let's appreciate the good stuff. Apartheid has been scrapped. It's done away with by the late 80s. Essentially, apartheid was dead. And by the 90s, it was not even applied anywhere, and completely scrapped in the early 90s. So for a couple of decades now, there hasn't been anything like that. No legislation discriminating against black folk, but there's been a lot of legislation now instituted discriminating against white folk. So how far have we come? It's almost as though the lessons of the past have not been learnt, which is a great shame. But we have been left with the good things of the so-called colonialism, and as I say, the Cape was never colonized by the Dutch. It was a refreshment station purely and simply, but the people who were born there, who became Africans, white Africans, they settled in the land, and they trekked inland and established South Africa. So they certainly aren't colonialists. In fact, they were colonized by Britain to a large extent. The British just came in and attacked the little republics and colonized them for quite a while. So we really do have a lot to be grateful for. We have a lot of good things in this country which were brought in by the Europeans, and it's about time that was recognized. And South Africa would just be another African basket case if it wasn't for them. If it wasn't the European settlers, we wouldn't have a good education system, or we had until recently. It's really slid backwards of late. We have got a communist, a full-blown communist. He's, in fact, the head of the Communist Party, is the Minister of Higher Education in this country. So you can imagine what our university's curriculum is now and what they're being taught in the high schools, Marxist thinking. And unfortunately, a tree is known by its fruits.
Yes.
And we can see there's very little good coming out of it. Our degrees from our universities were highly respected all over the world. And that is now not the case really anymore. And lately, you may have seen it on the news, there's been a big campaign by black university students called Rhodes Must Fall.
Yes.
And they're talking about Cecil Rhodes, which I'm sure will come up on your program at some stage. Cecil Rhodes probably wasn't the nicest guy. He was a ruthless businessman, but in his day he was highly respected, and he could lay claim to having built the modern South Africa. And he left his huge financial legacy to the people of South Africa and the people of the world in the form of scholarships to Oxford, etc. He left the Kirstenbosch Gardens, the grounds of the University of Cape Town are standing on, huge big public buildings. He left in his will to the people of South Africa, which is very generous, and I haven't seen that being repeated in the modern day. All the politicians seem to do is grab. They leave nothing to the people, whereas Rhodes did, and yet they want to pull down his statues. They're calling him imperialist, etc. And in those days, Britain was the great empire. He was part of it. He did a lot more good than bad, and yet his legacy is now being besmirched. So there's another. Well, it would probably be stretching it to call him a South African hero, except perhaps to some. But we have to come to some sort of term to describe him, and I would say that he would be one of the great personalities in South African history, as was Jan van Riebeeck. And certainly we have got a lot of culture and history which we owe to Jan van Riebeeck, because he brought civilization to the Cape of Africa.
Absolutely. And it would be interesting for me, Cuan, is to find out whether the Defukani killed more blacks than were exported as slaves. It would be very interesting for me.
Karen, no slaves were ever exported from America, interestingly enough. No South African was ever enslaved.
No, I know that. But they blame us. All over the world, the whites are frowned upon because of slavery.
Oh, I see what you mean.
And
yes.
So it would be interesting to know whether the original Zulus killed more blacks than the whites exported. Well, the Arabs actually exported them. They were sold by their own people to the Arabs, who exported them to countries all over the world. But it would be interesting to have that comparison, whether we as white people, being responsible for slavery all over the world, actually enslaved more than the formation of the Zulu tribe killed.
Well, certainly the estimates run from hundreds of thousands to millions that were killed in the Defukani, as you rightly called it, the Great Crushing, which was started by Shaka and continued by one of his runaway generals, Masilikatsi, as he moved north. They devastated the entire countryside, and the Trek Boers moving inland found huge areas completely cleared of any blacks. They'd all been killed by their own people, mainly the Zulus and what became the Matabele, which were a Zulu offshoot, who moved up into what was then Zimbabwe and crushed the locals in Zimbabwe, were the Shona. So yes, huge numbers were killed, by their own. And as you rightly say, the great slave traders of the day, besides Britain, were the Arabs. But they never had to go inland. That's an interesting thing, to capture slaves. Their slaves were waiting in chains for them at the ports, captured by their own chiefs.
Yes.
The black chiefs would capture neighboring tribes, even sometimes their own people who they had fallen foul of them, and sell them to these slave traders. So the whites basically transported them across to the colonies, but they were sold into slavery by their own people. And it's interesting to note that Amistad, the famous movie,
yes,
the Hollywood version of history, which is generally bunkum, had him, this poor African slave, finally being released, gaining his freedom, etc. What the movie doesn't mention is that he reputedly went back to Africa and became a slave trader. So a dose of reality is needed in history, a dose of facts. People like to go along with the Hollywood version. They think, oh, they must have done their research, so it must be accurate. Well, I can tell you now, it's not. And we watch in amazement at how history is distorted by Hollywood to suit various agendas and to deflect blame and etc. And the white people were the ones who ended slavery. People seem to forget that. And the British Navy for decades hunted the seas for slavers and captured the slave ships and freed the slaves, etc. It was the white folk who ended slavery. Nobody else did. We did. So we have at least that claim to say, yes, we were part of the slave trade for centuries, and for thousands of years slavery was very common. It was throughout the world, so we were nothing exceptional or special. But we were certainly involved, but we are the ones who forcefully ended it, the white folk, nobody else. The Arabs carried on, and to this day, some say
still
there's
have
a lot
slaves.
of slavery in North Africa, yes.
Yes.
So that you're absolutely right.
Well, we're coming to the end of the show. That was the quickest 2 hours I've ever lived through. Cuan, I look forward to having you on again once we've decided who our next historical figure will be. And I thank you very much for giving up so much of your time to research and to record these shows. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the next one. Good night, everybody.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Good night to you.
Thank you for listening, and we will speak to you again next week, same time, same place.